I'm Jenny, and I've been writing code longer than most of my coworkers have been out of college. I'm what they call a senior software engineer, though the senior part often seems to make people forget the engineer part. For the last 8 years, I've worked at Atlas Tech, a mid-sized company that thinks it's a tech giant where fluorescent lights hum overhead and coffee is currency. My mornings usually start the same. A lukewarm cup of whatever's left in the break room, pot, a quiet nod to the few early birds in engineering, and then straight to my desk in the back corner. It's not glamorous, but it's where the bones of our biggest software product, Nimbus, live and breathe. Nimbus is a monster of a system, a hybrid cloud solution with layers of legacy code tangled into microservices and automation pipelines. It's the kind of thing that looks great in sales decks and gives developers ulcers. And it's my responsibility to keep it alive. Around me, the usual cast of characters began their routines. Lisa in QA muttering at her second monitor like it owed her money. Dev from DevOps already deep into a battle with Jenkins that I could hear from my seat. And Kyle, our bright-eyed junior dev, was trying to figure out why his terminal had turned completely green. There's a rhythm to tech offices that doesn't get written into job descriptions. The quiet clicking of keys, the soft swearing when something breaks the laughter that ripples through Slack messages before vanishing into Git commits. It's not warm exactly, but it's familiar. I've been on the Nimbus project since day one. I built its first architecture diagram on a whiteboard with a dying marker and too much caffeine. I've watched it grow, break, rebuild itself, and evolve with every shift in product direction or executive impulse. At some point, it stopped being just a system and became something I could feel in my bones. Most people here know me as the person who gets things done, not flashy, not loud, just steady. The kind of engineer who knows which microservice is going to panic when daylight saving hits and who can trace a memory leak like it's a murder mystery. Of course, steady doesn't always mean visible. I don't have a fancy title. I never went to Stanford or wore a blazer to a stand-up meeting. But when systems crash at 2 a.m., it's my number they call. Not because they like me, but because I know where the bodies are buried. I've learned to live in that space between critical and invisible. It's not the worst place to be. Until the morning it wasn't. That Tuesday started like any other. I had no idea it would be the last time Nimbus still felt like mine. It was just after 10 when the email came in. Subject line, quick sync. Sender, Derek Mathers. My manager of 6 months younger than me by at least a decade, and always brimming with the kind of energy that made you tired just watching him. I grabbed my notepad, assuming it was about a backlog prioritization, or maybe some issue with the staging environment. The conference room was already half lit when I walked in, that stale, recycled air clinging to the carpet like regret. Derek stood by the window, arms crossed, laptop open but untouched. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He motioned to a chair, and I sat down, slowly, notebook still in my lap. Then he said my name in that rehearsed tone people use when they're about to say something they know will upset you, but want you to believe it's a positive change. Jenny, we're restructuring a bit on the Nimbus project. I blinked once, kept my face neutral. I'd heard this phrase before. I've lived through enough corporate reshuffles to know it usually meant someone else got promoted, or worse, someone got pushed out. He kept talking. We've hired a new lead, someone with dual degrees, MIT for computer science, Harvard for their MBA. Brilliant guy. Great perspective. We think he can really drive innovation on Nimbus moving forward. I felt the words fall like glass inside my head. I asked if this meant I was being reassigned. He paused. Not exactly. You'll still be supported during the transition, but after that, we'll see where your skill set fits best. The way he said it felt like a shrug wearing a suit, clean, detached, polished enough to leave no fingerprints. I nodded, but my hands gripped the edge of the table tighter than I realized. I didn't say anything. What could I say? That I'd built the system from scratch, that I'd missed holidays debugging memory leaks, that I'd poured years of silent, invisible work into something now being handed off because I didn't check the right academic boxes. The room felt smaller by the second. He smiled again, said something about change being hard but necessary. I thanked him, automatically, like a reflex trained over years of pretending to accept things you don't actually accept. Then I stood and left, still holding my notebook like it had answers. Back at my desk, the monitors glowed like nothing had happened. My team was still laughing about something on Slack. The world kept moving, but in my chest something settled. Heavy, familiar. That quiet voice that says, no matter how good you are, it's never enough without the right credentials. They weren't firing me. That would have been easier. No, they were replacing me. Quietly, respectfully. Politely enough to leave no bruise, but sharp enough that I'd feel the cut for days. I'd seen this before. Not the first time. But it still stung. You don't get used to being invisible. I watched the lines of code on my screen blur. My fingers didn't move. Somewhere, someone had decided my work needed to look better on paper. They'd chosen pedigree over history, optics over substance. And the worst part, they truly thought it was progress. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I wasn't angry yet, not really. What I felt was something colder, something quieter. The kind of feeling that doesn't lash out, it plans. During my first month at Atlas Tech, while most people were still decorating their desks or memorizing coffee machine codes, I was reading the employee handbook cover to cover, not skimming, reading every clause, every footnote, every buried section of corporate legal jargon that most folks forgot the minute orientation ended. It wasn't about being diligent, it was about survival. I'd spent enough time in tech to know that power rarely comes from titles. It comes from knowing how the system works when no one else bothers to look. So when Derek dropped his polished little bomb about my replacement, I didn't panic. I remembered Section 9.42. Buried deep in the access control policies was one line that had always stuck with me. Production-level permissions can be assigned by a lead engineer or granted automatically if the individual holds verified credentials in system-level architecture. At the time, I'd flagged it in my brain as both vague and dangerous. Now it was something else. It was leverage. That clause was written for convenience, for hiring speed, for onboarding senior hires with fancy resumes and impressive schools. What it wasn't written for was scrutiny. Or consequences. If Brandon, the new golden hire, had those degrees they were bragging about, then technically he qualified. On paper, at least. And the system wouldn't block what it saw as a verified authority. It would let him walk right in with admin rights if someone like me built the bridge. That's the part no one ever thinks about. The bridge, the handover. The trust embedded in systems no one outside engineering really understands. But I did. And I wasn't planning on burning anything down. I just wasn't going to stop the fire when it started. Brandon showed up with a crisp shirt, bright smile, and a notebook too clean to trust. He introduced himself like he was on a panel at a startup expo, polished and proud of every credential listed on his LinkedIn. I smiled back, calm and pleasant, like a waitress pouring coffee before a storm. He wanted to dive right into the architecture. So I walked him through it. From the surface, everything sounded clean, clear, logical. I explained our authentication module as a simple pass-through, glossing over the deeply embedded permission hooks buried 6 layers deep. I mentioned how our client data pipelines had redundancies, but left out how one wrong flag would remove them entirely. He nodded, eager, taking notes without understanding. I showed him diagrams that looked straightforward, trimmed of their complexity, just enough to let him believe he saw the whole picture. When he asked questions, I gave answers that were technically true, but contextually empty. He thought I was being thorough. I was being surgical. I pointed him toward the scheduler service, letting him believe it could run batch updates without risk, even though he never asked about the rollback logic. That silence wasn't mine to fix. By the second hour, he was complimenting the system's elegance. I kept nodding, kept feeding just enough detail to make him feel comfortable, but not enough to make him cautious. He assumed confidence was mastery. I let him. Before we wrapped up, I guided him through setting up his admin access. I told him the system would recognize his credentials as senior level thanks to his academic background. He looked impressed. Not with me, with himself. That part was important. He never realized I gave him the rope. He was too busy adjusting the knot, proud of how well it fit. Fridays at Atlas Tech always had that strange tension. Half the office had one foot out the door, but the systems didn't care what day it was. That afternoon, I stayed late, not because I had to, but because I knew Brandon would. He'd been quiet all day. Not unusual, but focused in a different way. The kind of energy people get when they think they're about to prove something. I caught a glimpse of his screen on my way back from the kitchen. He was knee-deep in the authentication module. My stomach didn't sink. It settled. By 4:30, most people had gone home. The halls were quiet. Keyboards are still for the weekend. Brandon stayed. Of course he did. His office door was open, brows furrowed, fingers flying like he was writing his thesis all over again. At 4:47 p.m., I got the ping. A silent alert from the deployment logs I still had access to. System modification request. Origin Brandon. Target user permissions schema. Deployment status auto-approved. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. I opened the logs and read through his changes. The elegance of it would have made a professor proud. He had rewritten a portion of the access logic to remove what he flagged as redundant checks. In theory, it would streamline login for clients during high-traffic periods. In practice, it stripped away 2 layers of internal verification that protected against injection attempts and role escalation. To him, it probably looked like optimization, cleaner code, fewer steps, better performance. But in reality, he had removed the exact safeguards I'd spent years embedding in the system to prevent breaches. He had replaced a complex but secure flow with something fast and brittle. And because of the credentials I gave him, the system let it all go through. By 5:03, the change had gone live. The security scanner hadn't flagged it yet. That was scheduled for Sunday night. Until then, the authentication database was wide open to anyone who knew how to query around it. Client data, password hashes, session tokens. All of it was exposed without proper barriers. I watched it all from my desk, silent. The green lights on our monitoring dashboard still glowed like nothing had happened. To the untrained eye, everything looked stable, but I knew better. I could see the cracks forming small at first, like hairline fractures in a dam. Brandon leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He sipped something from a reusable bottle and looked around like he wanted someone to notice. No one did. Except me. He didn't speak as I passed his desk, just smiled. I smiled back. That was the thing about systems like Nimbus. They didn't break with drama. They broke quietly, slowly, and when they finally snapped, the fallout wasn't loud. It was surgical, clean, traceable, and always, always documented. I packed my bag and powered down. On the way out, I glanced once more at the server logs. His signature was stamped on every line, the perfect trail, the perfect storm. All it needed was time. By 7:12 a.m., Monday, the first alert hit my inbox. Security anomaly detected. The subject line was bland, but I knew exactly what it meant. I'd been waiting for it. By 7:26, the follow-up came. Critical exposure in the Nimbus authentication system. Unauthorized access potential confirmed. Legal and compliance were already looped in. The kind of email that makes CTOs cancel meetings and executives lose sleep. I sipped my coffee slowly and slid my laptop into my bag. I was in the office by 7:45. The building felt tense like air before a thunderstorm. People spoke in half whispers. Derek was pacing outside the war room, face-pale phone glued to his ear. By 8:00, the emergency meeting was underway. Conference room Alpha. Project leads, DevOps, legal, security, and me. I took my seat, calmly opened my laptop, and waited. Sarah Klein, our CTO, walked in like she had seen this movie before. No panic, just precision. She took her seat, opened her folder, and started reading off the facts. Data breach vector identified. Source internal. Time-stamped. Authorized credentials. She looked at me. Jenny, can you walk us through what happened? I nodded once and began. I pulled up the deployment logs, walked through the timestamps, highlighted the schema changes, showed the authentication table stripped of safeguards, showed the approval trail. Then I turned the monitor so the room could see. Author Brandon Ellis. Approved by Brandon Ellis. The silence was deep. Derek shifted in his seat, jaw tight. Brandon looked like he'd forgotten how to breathe. He tried to speak. Mumbled something about system optimization. He glanced at me like I might help him fill in the gaps. I didn't. Sarah cut him off. Her voice was low but lethal. You modified production-level access protocols without peer review. You bypassed validation. You exposed every client record in the database. Brandon stammered about wanting to improve efficiency, about how he thought it was redundant logic. He said I'd walked him through it. I did, I said flatly. I walked you through exactly what was there. What you did with it was your call. Sarah turned to Derek. Did you verify his technical understanding before handing him full access? Derek froze, blinked, then said something about his degrees, about his credentials, about how he trusted him. Sarah's tone sharpened. Credentials do not equal competence. Access without oversight is malpractice. She turned back to Brandon. Your access is revoked, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. You are not to return. Brandon stood slowly, still trying to protest, but no one moved. No one defended him. Even Derek stayed quiet, staring at the table like it might swallow him whole. As Brandon gathered his laptop, I closed my own. Calm, silent, satisfied. Justice doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it walks in with a flash drive and a paper trail. I didn't look at him as he passed. I didn't need to. I had already watched him fall. All that was left now was the echo. By the end of that week, things had quieted down. The incident was being documented, internal systems were locked tighter than ever, and HR was drafting new protocols that probably wouldn't be read. I got called into another meeting this time by Sarah. She was calm, direct, and more respectful than anyone else had been in months. She offered me a consulting position. Flexible hours, double the pay, full autonomy. Said they needed someone who truly understood the architecture, someone who could rebuild trust from the inside out. I thanked her, genuinely. But I said no, not out of anger, not even out of pride, just clarity. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do after surviving a fire is to walk away from the ashes. I'd given Atlas Tech nearly a decade. I'd built their most important system, carried it through crashes, pivots, and weekends when no one else picked up the phone. But they didn't see me until I wasn't there. They didn't recognize my value until the lack of it almost burned the company down. And that's not the kind of place I want to grow in. I don't need a fancy title or an office with a view. I just need respect. And I refuse to keep begging for it. I cleared out my desk the following Monday. No drama, no announcement, just a quiet exit. A few nods, some handshakes, one or two awkward thank yous from people who had once ignored me in meetings, but I left with my head up. Because I know what I'm worth now, I always did deep down. It just took being replaced to realize I don't have to prove that to people who never bothered to see it. There are a lot of Jennies out there. People who carry systems teams, even entire departments on their backs. They don't make noise. They don't ask for attention. But without them, everything falls apart. So maybe you're one of them, or maybe you know someone like that. Here's the question I'll leave you with. What would happen if the quiet ones finally stopped cleaning up everyone else's mess? And what would it take for us to value them before the fire, not after?